Mary Magnuson. On behalf of the Blandin Foundation, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on NTIA's broadband programs. This is one in a series of monthly webinars we're offering for our Blandin broadband communities and open to anyone with an interest in using technology to improve community. Before we begin, I'll point to the chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. To interact with us at any time during today's webinar, you can simply type your question or comment in the chat box. And now let's get started. Again, my name is Mary Magnuson. I work here at the Blandin Foundation and I administer the Blandin Community Broadband Program. Joining me today is Laura Breeden, Program Director for Public Computing and Broadband Adoption for NTIA, and Bill Coleman of Community Technology Advisors, who has been Blandin Foundation's primary broadband program consultant for a number of years. Bill is going to take a few minutes at the end of the webinar today to talk about Blandin Foundation's and other Minnesota responses to the Broadband Opportunity Council's request for comment, which were submitted last week. So now I'll introduce Laura. Laura Breeden is joining us today from Washington, D.C. Her full title is Program Director for Public Computing and Broadband Adoption, Broadband Technology Opportunities Program, Broadband USA, National Telecommunications and Information Administration, U.S. Department of Commerce. Laura joined NTIA in May of 2009 to lead the public computing and sustainable broadband adoption components of BTOP, the $4.7 billion competitive grant program funded by the Recovery Act. Post her full bio on the webinar archive, but as a bit of background, she has worked in the public, private, and nonprofit sector since 1983 to advance the use of modern digital communications for the public good. Laura shared with me and Bill yesterday that this is very likely her last webinar. She is retiring on June 30th. So on behalf of the Foundation and our partners, thanks Laura for all you've done and best wishes for a happy retirement.
Thank you so much, Mary. That's wonderful.
Oh, go get your slides up. There you go.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. We are really happy to have the opportunity, even at a distance, to interact with our friends in Minnesota. We have been to Minnesota a number of times. We've had some very successful BTOP grant programs in Minnesota, and we also held a regional meeting there. And I'll talk a little bit more soon about regional meetings, but I thought you would enjoy seeing some of your very own in this photograph, which was taken in St. Paul or maybe Minneapolis. I should know that, shouldn't I?
I think it was Minneapolis.
And I know that you all recognize Dana McKenzie from the State Broadband Office. The woman just behind Dana, Dana's the tall, blonde lady in the front. That woman just behind Dana with that puzzled look on her face is Ann Neville, who ran the State Broadband Initiative, the mapping program for us. And on the right-hand side of the table is Lynn Chadwick, who's one of the program officers. So I don't know if any of you have met Ann or Lynn, but they're part of the team here at Broadband USA. On the right, you can see some of the table signs that we used to organize the discussions over lunch at this meeting. And in the mirror, you can see just barely reflected a lady with short blonde hair holding up an iPhone to take this picture, and that's me. So I thought this would kind of establish our credibility on the ground there in Minnesota. And just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that went on in Minnesota with NTIA funding, this is a map which you can log into at the URL that you see on the bottom of your screen that shows for the entire United States the investments that BTOP made in communities. In Minnesota, if you blew this up a bit, you'd be able to see that there are a number of places where there are sustainable broadband adoption projects. You can also see the solid lines running across the state are actually fiber deployments. We had a PCC, a Public Computer Center project in Minneapolis that was run by the university there, and a number of other things going on in the state. So I would encourage you, if you have questions or you just want to play with this, and there are a lot of different ways to visualize the information, that you explore the map. We are updating it now with information that was accurate as of the end of calendar 2014, and that new version should be up in just a few days. So again, welcome. Please feel free to raise your hand virtually if you have any questions or you'd like to go in a different direction. I'd be happy to take questions at any point. And since I'm not sure how much you all are familiar with what we do, I'll kind of start at the beginning, and I'll move fairly quickly through this. So if you have questions or you'd like an explanation, please, as I said, feel free to raise your virtual hand at any point. And Mary, what do folks actually do if they have a question? Can they just unmute themselves or write in the chat box?
Yeah, the chat box, and
okay.
Bill will keep an eye on the chat box and
great.
If you miss anything.
Okay, so the chat box is on the lower left-hand corner of the screen. I think Mary's going to put her red pencil in it now.
Yeah.
There you go. So NTIA is an agency of the U.S. Department of Commerce, and we have been around since 1978. We were established by President Carter to be the President's principal advisor on telecommunications policy. Lots of things have changed about telecommunications since 1978, obviously, but one of the things that's always been part of the NTIA mission is to promote equity of access to new communication technologies. So for many, many years there was a program here that upgraded equipment at public broadcasting stations so that particularly smaller stations, stations in rural areas or remote areas would have access to newer modern equipment. We're also the agency that managed the coupon program for the digital television transition, which you may remember from a few years ago, made coupons available to people who met an income test so that they would not lose access to television during this digital conversion process. I first came to NTIA in 1994 under the Clinton administration to work on what was called then the National Information Infrastructure. And I worked on a grant program that was making awards for innovative applications of the internet in the public sector back when that was all very new. So NTIA has a long history of working in new technologies and in particular around equity in new technologies. We ran the BTOP program starting in 2009, and BTOP was a $4 billion grant program, matching grants to states, localities, private sector companies, a very broad eligibility pool. And it was really designed to help in the recovery from the economic recession of 2008 and to buttress the broadband infrastructure in the country and bring more people online. We knew that the grant program had a finite lifetime. It was part of the stimulus, and we had to award all of the funds. And by September of 2010, and the grants had about 3 years to run. So perhaps 2 years ago, we started thinking about what can we do with the assets that have been created, both the knowledge here at NTIA, but also importantly, the relationships that had been created both between NTIA and people in the field, but also across regions and with other federal agencies here, because we had been doing outreach to a number of agencies that have programs that could benefit from improved broadband access. So we were very much poised in January of 2015 when the President announced his new broadband initiative to launch Broadband USA, which is funded right now at about $3 million a year, and we're leveraging the assets, as I said, that were created as part of BTOP. So why are we doing this? Well, there is still a need, as you know very well, for additional broadband investment and deployment of broadband. And local communities are being very creative and assertive about solving the problem of broadband access. And we want to be able to help with that. We learned a lot through the administration of the grants program. We've created some products that I'll mention a bit later. And we also have developed a lot of relationships that have led to conferences like the one that we conducted last year in Minneapolis with the Fiber to the Home Council. So we think that it's very important to shine a spotlight on those successful programs and good new ideas in the field and bring that information to communities that are trying to figure out how to develop their own broadband resources. About 78 million people still do not have broadband at home. It's about 25% of the population. Those people are disproportionately poor, rural, older, and less educated. And those are some of the gaps that we were trying to address as part of BTOP, really focusing on, for example, with the grant that we gave to the Blandin Foundation, how can we extend broadband in rural areas? And Blandin is one of our showcase projects in that they had an approach that was very solid that allowed local communities to enter into a process to define their own needs and requirements and then figure out how to meet them with appropriate support from the foundation. So I don't have to tell you that broadband is really important for rural development across a whole range of things. And in January, when the President announced his new initiative, these are some of the things he said about broadband. I'm going to preface this slide by saying that I went to a conference about 2 years ago that was actually organized by the Broadband Mapping grantee in the state of North Carolina. And it was a conference here in Washington, academic economists, and they were debating the impact of broadband on the economy. And I heard a joke, which I've told a lot of times since then, and I'm going to share with you. What do economists say when you ask them why we still don't really understand the impacts, the economic impacts of the French Revolution? The answer is not enough time has passed. So what I've observed is that it's very hard in a field that's evolving as quickly as telecommunications and broadband and internet to stay ahead of the data collection needs and ask the right questions. Nevertheless, there has been a fair amount of research on this, and one place that you can go and look for the sources is a study that we actually commissioned back in 2010 of the BTOP social and economic impact. And all of that information is online. And they did an extensive, this was a consulting company that won a competitive procurement, and they did a very extended bibliography, which is part of one of the sources of this data. So not surprisingly, you find that people who can use the internet and who have technology skills and who do use them either at home or at work are likely to earn more and to have more mobility in the job market as well. Broadband availability increases employment. We saw a significant increase in broadband availability just in the first 2 years of the BTOP infrastructure grants, and during most of this time the networks were being constructed, but we saw a 2% increase in BTOP counties over counties that were matched with them in terms of demographics and economics, but a 2% increase in broadband availability just in the early stages of the grants. And we saw a huge drop in the cost of broadband service, particularly to anchor institutions, which were the first organizations to get connected. And if you are interested in this information, I have the URL for the research study, and I'll be pointing that out later. So the new initiative really pulls our expertise together and our relationships so that we can work effectively with communities to help best practices get rapidly into the field and to help people who are doing the work on the ground find each other. We provide advice. We have some tools for assessing adoption and infrastructure planning. And also important, we bring the stakeholders together. So there's a huge conversation going on now about how to use broadband funds, how much funding to put in from the government for broadband, and I know you've been having a similar conversation in your state, and around what can federal agencies do to move the ball forward. And I'll talk about that toward the end of the presentation when I discuss the Broadband Opportunity Council. But I think, as I said in my comments recently to someone, if you've seen one rural community, you've seen one rural community. And the sharing of information is what enables communities to then go back and dig into the needs and the assets of their communities and move forward broadband issues. So it's really been terrific to be part of that. Among the kinds of technical assistance that we have been providing are one-to-one consultations. So we've been doing phone calls with communities that have questions about financing or construction or permitting or partnerships. And we've also published toolkits and information based on the work that we've done in the field. The two that are available now are a toolkit for broadband adoption and a guide to public-private partnerships for broadband investment, which largely focuses on broadband build-out. Both of those are available from the website and again are based on really field-proven practices for getting things done. If you were interested in talking to someone here about what's going on in your community, I'll put up the email address later, and someone, if you write into us, we will get in touch with you to find out what technical assistance we might be able to help you with. I've said this already, so I won't belabor it, but bringing people together, sharing information, facilitating the sharing of information and help to support regional networks is one of the most important things I think we've been able to do through this process, and that's one of the things we want to continue to do with Broadband USA. We had, as I said, the last meeting, we had a meeting in September in Minnesota, then we had a meeting in Mississippi in February, and we're in the planning stages for another meeting next fall. The interagency partnerships turn out to be very important because lots of federal agencies have an interest in or actually fund broadband-related activities. And we've been working on those issues for quite a long time, really throughout the life of the BTOP program, because it was very clear to us that that was an important thing to focus on. Happily for us, the President created a Broadband Opportunity Council that is a formal interagency effort to identify things that the executive action. So not so much congressional, not the FCC, which is an independent agency, but to bring these agencies together and identify executive actions that agencies could take to really streamline, get rid of barriers, do a better job of collaborating. And I'll talk more about that later. We're in an exciting phase of that because we just closed the public comment period. This is how you get in touch with us. We have a phone number, there's our website, and there's our email address. So we are very happy to talk with you about specific questions or needs. And here are some of the resources that I talked about. The Toolkit, which is a guide to broadband adoption. How do you think about it? How do you know what your needs are? How do you approach the question of training or of communicating about it, outreach, messaging? It's divided into chapters that focus on specific barriers to broadband adoption, like cost and relevance, and that provide field-tested approaches to solving those problems. The social and economic impact study that I mentioned has a number of case studies, including one of the Blandin Foundation project. I invite you to take a look at that. But it also includes a final report, some interim reporting, particularly on economic information, and as I mentioned, an extensive bibliography. We're also, if anybody on the call is a research buff, we're making the raw data that the report used in doing the economic analysis available. It's going through an internal clearance process now, which has to do with making sure that we're not releasing any confidential information, personal information. But that will be available shortly. And then the public-private partnership guide that I talked about. Any questions so far? I'm reading in the corner. Did I borrow that from Bernadine?
You may have.
I probably did. I probably did. Yes, yes. So let me start, go ahead and talk about the Broadband Opportunity Council. The president, and I don't know if any of you were tracking this, but he went to a small town in Iowa where the electric utility had built out a fiber network to manage the grid, and on top of that had been offering very high-speed broadband at very affordable prices to the community. And I think one of the drivers was there's a fairly vigorous debate going on in the country about whether municipalities should be able to offer broadband service to their citizens and residents and businesses and so forth. And a number of states have passed laws against allowing that to happen. And those laws are actually being challenged by some municipalities that have already moved in the direction of developing or already have their own high-speed networks that are municipally owned or municipally operated. And that challenge was to those laws was upheld by the FCC not too long ago, and is working its way through the court system, which is what you might expect. So the president in January announced a new broadband initiative, and part of that initiative was to underscore that the administration believes that communities should have a range of options in front of them and that they should not be preempted by state laws. One of the other things that the president wanted to do was look for ways for federal agencies to be more supportive of broadband, and that was the genesis of the Broadband Opportunity Council. So On March 23rd, the President signed a memo establishing the Broadband Opportunity Council. You can read this, it's on the White House website, and I'll have the web address in just a minute. This is a presidential memorandum is a formal instruction from the President to the agencies about taking some particular action. And in this case, I included here on the slide the goals, including coordinating policies to promote broadband deployment and adoption, promoting best practices, breaking down regulatory barriers, and encouraging further investment. So those are the goals of the Broadband Opportunity Council. The council involves a number of agencies. In the next slide, I'll show you all of them. And the goal is really to see where, again, within the context of executive action, so we're not really focused on legislation. The FCC is an independent regulatory agency. The President does not direct them. But they are a kind of ad hoc member of the Broadband Opportunity Council. But what could we do in terms of regulation, investment, promotion of broadband adoption to really make some progress and open up some new avenues? The President was very specific about some of the things that he asked the agencies to do. So one of the tasks that we actually completed in May is a survey of federal agencies about broadband programs and regulations, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. Also, the agencies must submit by July 21st action recommendations. What can you do? And it has to be very specific, and it has to be doable from inside the executive branch and within a fairly near-term time frame. And then there will be a final action agenda with prioritized recommendations for action specific to each agency that will be delivered to the President in August. At that point, the Broadband Opportunity Council may dissolve. I don't think we know, and I'm not sure that the White House knows yet exactly how they want to handle this. But for the moment, these are the agencies that are part of the Broadband Opportunity Council. A number of the ones toward the end of the list in the far right column are actually not federal agencies. They're offices within the White House, so they report to the President directly, and they typically, they don't run programs, they don't have budget or make grants. So from the Council on Environmental Quality on down, those are these are White House offices. So it's been a really fascinating process to have people come together from all of these agencies. As some of them, you know, it's pretty clear what they have to do with broadband, because if you're the Department of Transportation, you own lots of rights of way and you lay down new highways and new railways, and a lot of that is very much part of what it means to build out broadband. So that's, and then some of the agencies, it might be a little less clear, but for the Veterans Affairs Administration, for example, their constituents, veterans, the large number of them live in rural areas. They have health problems, sometimes chronic health problems, and broadband is one of the things that the VA is looking to help deliver better care in a more timely fashion to those rural veterans. So how are we going to do this? As I said, we're surveying programs, and the language of the President's memorandum was very specific about this. Agencies were to report on programs that currently support broadband or could reasonably be modified to support broadband competition, deployment, or adoption. So that's kind of gotten agencies out of their comfort zone a bit, because they're being asked to think about existing programs that may, for reasons of history or just because no one's ever thought about it, they're not explicit about broadband support, but they could be modified. You could issue a clarification or a revision to your existing guidelines that would make it clear that funds are eligible for broadband adoption, say. We're also looking at regulatory barriers. Federal government has a lot of land and some assets like towers and buildings that might be part of a deployment of broadband, for example. Is it possible to make explicit that those assets are available and on what terms those assets are available, and to simplify finding out about them? So those are the kinds of things that the Broadband Opportunity Council is looking at. There's a working group that meets every week, and the principals, who typically are at the level of an undersecretary or deputy secretary, are meeting about 3 times over the period of the lifetime of the Broadband Opportunity Council. These are the kinds of questions that were on the survey that we did of agencies, which was, I think, really illuminating and did bring out a lot of interesting ideas from the agencies. We also released a request for comment, which closed on June 10th. The comments are all public now. You can look at them on our website. And we're using the comments to inform the final action. So people in submitting the comments had a lot of ideas about things that the federal government isn't doing well, or things that it could do better, or things that it could do differently. And we got over 240 comments. I want to give you a small preview of some of the things that we heard that were major themes. And one of them is that the federal agencies need to be clearer and more transparent about their timelines for reviewing grants, reviewing loan applications, reviewing applications for permits to cross federal land or for environmental waivers. There needs to be more transparency regarding all of those things. There needs to be some standardization around what broadband means. What is the definition of broadband? How fast is it, and who keeps up with that number, and how does it get established? Another thing that we heard from many of the commenters is that dig once is the only way to approach this, that when a new road or railway or waterway is being installed, or when one is being upgraded, broadband providers should be allowed to install infrastructure during these construction projects. And we ought to know when those projects are happening and where, so that providers can take advantage of the construction. There's a pretty strong sentiment that some of the restrictions on using existing conduit or existing rights-of-way that might have been funded with money from one agency but isn't being used and could actually be applied for other purposes, that those agencies should look at whether they have the authority, in fact, to let that asset be used in the public good by someone else. So, for instance, it's my understanding that the Department of Transportation while it allows the installation of conduit with fiber, has some regulations that make it difficult for anyone else than the Department of Transportation to use that capacity, even if the capacity is not fully needed by the transportation people. So sorting all of that out, like what are the rules and how are they interpreted, and are they applied consistently, and are they flexible? Those are the kinds of questions that we're asking. And then there's a lot of interest in rural issues generally. And rural populations are considered vulnerable, much as veterans and tribal populations are. How can we take steps to promote a more equitable kind of distribution of service and availability? In August, the BOC will produce a report to the President that will take information that's been gathered through the survey, the public request for comments, through some meetings that are going on now at each agency to really dig into the ideas that were provided in the survey and the recommendations in the public comments to come up with a very specific prioritized list of action recommendations. With timelines, so it's a very serious assignment. That is due, I believe, August 20th. So some people here, not me because I'm working, but some people here are going to have a very busy summer. The President also announced there was going to be a Broadband Summit, and originally it was going to be in June. We're now hearing that it's going to be in July, most likely. It will include municipalities and others that are working on improving broadband deployment. It may be webcast, I don't know. We're not directly involved in managing it. That's being done by a program called US Ignite, which is a program that was jointly created by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and the National Science Foundation. And I included their web address, so you can go to them if you have any questions at all. These are the addresses of the presidential memorandum, the original request for comment notice that appeared in the Federal Register, and a fact sheet that the White House had called Broadband That Works. And you can also explore our website, which is where the comments themselves are housed. And again, you can feel free to ask us questions about them. The formal comment period closed on June 10th, but if you want to send us email, or you want to direct it to Larry Strickling, who's our Assistant Secretary and who co-chairs the Broadband Opportunity Council, we're happy to hear those. And once again, this is how you can get in touch with us. And these folks are from California. They're actually from I didn't have a picture of people from Minnesota, so I'm going to ask for someone to send us another picture of folks in Minnesota, which I'm sure the Blandin Foundation has a wonderful inventory of. And next time we do a webinar with you all, we will be able to include some Minnesota folks in this photograph.
I'll inform our communications team to pick out a couple photos for you.
That would be great.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Laura. Just remind everyone, if they have any questions, they think of any questions in the next 20 minutes or so, be sure to type them in our chat box. Laura will be here while Bill is speaking next.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mary.
You're welcome, Bill.
Oh, there you go. So we were excited to hear about this Broadband Opportunity Council and the opportunity to put a little bit more light on, put some Minnesota responses to that opportunity. And so the Blandin Foundation worked to do that. And so today I'm going to cover what we submitted, and then to submit or to show what other people in Minnesota did as well. So we did not just, Bernadine and Mary and I just did not sit down and make this up ourselves. We went to some of our key stakeholders, the Blandin Broadband Strategy Board, and then did use our considerable community experience to pull together some information. And overwhelming, kind of the overriding thing we thought about in trying to do this was the need to eliminate the digital divide, which we know is a big threat to equal opportunity. Recognizing what the program from NTIA, the BTOP program, our MERC project, Minnesota Intelligent Rural Community Program, the impact it had on Blandin Foundation's ability to drive broadband adoption in rural Minnesota. We've had a great experience working with Laura and her staff. That partnerships are key to success, everyone here on this webinar, and that the infrastructure is not enough, that investments in training are really essential. With that, we pulled together 3 themes that we really wanted to focus on. Collaboration was one, spur and support rural broadband cooperatives. We've seen in rural Minnesota in particular that places that have fiber to the home are rural broadband cooperatives, and we know they've done that over time and made those investments that have been now provide such great broadband in rural areas. We see that local ownership and commitment to a particular area as a great thing. And so how do we make that happen in other places? And then to continue the foundation's efforts to spur adoption and increase the sophistication of use. A lot of times things focus just on adoption and maybe on digital inclusion, but we know that for rural economic development that we need to increase the sophistication of use by the businesses, by schools, local governments, and so on. So those are the things that we focused on, and the foundation continues to focus on those. We looked at what Senator Clover Char put together for her comments to the Broadband Opportunity Council, and hers were, we thought, really good. Strengthening existing programs like the BTOP programs and Rural Utility Service, Rural Development out of USDA. Improve coordination with the states, especially with groups like Department of Economic Development's Office of Broadband Development, to continue to fund mapping efforts. I think that's something that we see our state office really focusing on as well. To advance public-private partnerships, especially around digging once, so that when roads are open, that infrastructure is being built, that multiple organizations get in there and participate. And then as well as the public safety wireless network, FirstNet, so that we have good leverage of the public sector investment there, so that assuming police and fire can drive around and have great connectivity, we should assume that residents will as well as a result of that network. And then finally, the idea of how do we maintain a modern infrastructure, and her comments there focused on the wireless spectrum, making sure that the spectrum is available, and trying to stimulate wireless deployment so that all across Minnesota wireless broadband is available. I mean, yesterday we had a little conference call and we had people driving across Minnesota, and we saw the many examples of people running into spots where broadband, much less cell coverage, was not sufficient to handle what we were trying to do, which was simply to have a conversation. The Office of Broadband put in significant comments, and I see that those are featured on the Blandin on Broadband blog here in the last day or so. They offered some excellent, well-prepared comments, so I give my kudos to them for their preparation and their study. One-stop shop for federal broadband website, so that you can see the USDA and the NTIA and whoever else has dollars available for broadband access and use. Continued federal support of broadband mapping. A lot of times we think those maps aren't very good, but they are a considerable improvement over the kind of guessing that we were doing previously. So those maps are a great tool. More flexible federal broadband finance programs. Right now, the USDA has funds for broadband loans, but we know that sometimes in rural areas, even borrowing money at low interest rates over long term isn't good enough to make a business case. And so that maybe some of those federal programs should be some kind of combination of loan and grant, maybe on a sliding scale of some kind. So I thought that was an innovative idea from the Office of Broadband. They called for close strategic coordination with many state broadband initiatives, and you can see whether it's on the investment that maybe USDA indeed could coordinate on funding some deals together to leverage each other's dollars was big. But then also a lot on permitting, and especially on federal lands, federal agencies, Park Service or Forest Service or Bureau of Land Management. Getting those things done in a timely manner and consistent manner. I think consistency was a huge part of that. A fairly troubling comment on bridge construction, that bridges aren't designed for fiber conduit unless somebody's ready to put the fiber in and is ready to pay for that. It seems to me, it would seem to most people with any common sense, that every bridge should have room for fiber and should be built for that, and that would just be a standard design consideration instead of an add-on. Deed was very eloquent on the idea about housing, and that the federal government funds a lot of housing, and that that should be taken into consideration, that especially for lower income housing, that the spaces for public access or that buildings should be wired for broadband would be important. Something that labor standards is something that we've heard about. The Minnesota has labor standards for, it's a broadband, border-to-border broadband fund, and that the labor standards, labor position descriptions are not necessarily consistent with the way fiber is built, and so the labor categories that the state puts, and I think the federal government puts fiber installers in, is similar to electricians, and we know that you can't die from holding on to two fibers at the same time, so maybe that's not quite right, so I'll call for better consideration on federal labor standards. And we've heard that the cost to adhere to those labor standards with the deed funds is anywhere from 25 to 40% on labor costs. So that's a huge impact on that. And then a call by the state for state inclusion on federal working groups. So that is the consider things at the federal level that maybe they should have some state voices on there as well. In terms of Universal Service Fund, which is a FCC program, consideration about E-rate, Lifeline, and health and education programs, that there should be look at those rules to see how those are now in place and maybe how they're stopping collaboration or hindering collaboration between people who use those programs. And so that's a critical piece, especially on the E-rate with schools and healthcare folks. In terms of Lifeline, there was a big support for lifeline being applied to broadband as well as telephone. And then support for digital inclusion efforts, particularly with libraries, but also with veterans and early education. And so those are the federal, or those are the responses to the Broadband Opportunity Council from Minnesota that we have seen. So if other people have submitted comments, we would love to see them, and we can highlight those on the blog. We asked about the Minnesota Telecom Alliance, and apparently they did not submit comments, I think relying on their national provider partners to provide those comments. So that was the voice from Minnesota, and hopefully they're listening. And with that, I'll turn it back to Mary.
Thanks, Bill. I don't see any other questions, so I guess we'll just finish up. Well, thanks again to Laura and Bill for joining us on the webinar today. Our next webinar will be Thursday, July 9th from 3 to 4 p.m. and the topic is Creative Spaces, Creative Places. Thanks everyone for attending and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Mary. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.